This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. My guest is Paul DeMartini, managing partner of the Newport Consulting Group and a leading advisor to utilities regulators and the U.S. Department of Energy on distribution system business policy and technologies. In Paul's almost 50 years in the energy sector, he's held leadership and consultant positions with, among others, Cisco Systems, MIT, the European Commission, the California Energy Commission, and major investor-owned utilities. In this episode of the USEA Power Sector Podcast series on new utility planning paradigms, we're going to talk about the impacts on the power sector of variable and customer-owned energy resources, rising demand, and new policies. And Paul's going to describe how and where policymakers and utilities are moving from traditional planning innovations like integrated distribution system planning and integrated system planning to optimize future electricity cost and reliability. Paul, traditional planning processes just seem no longer adequate to address today's opportunities and challenges. You've worked with utilities and system planners on new approaches, but before we get into them, why is this shift in utility planning practices happening? In what timeframes do utilities plan, and what's the overall goal of the new approaches?
Well, Herman, what utilities are starting to look at and experiencing is fairly significant uptake in community and customer distributed solar and storage adoption, which has been driven by federal and state policies. And those policies are driving towards a 40 to 50% increase in the adoption of solar and storage relative to the utility system peak. At the same time, electrification is driving load growth that may increase by 40% over the next 10 to 15 years. Just to give you an example, PG&E in a recent public document indicated that they are almost at 40% of system peak with distributed solar and storage. A lot of that is community, but also rooftop solar and storage. And then, of course, we know there's been several studies looking at electrification and the 40% increase. But PG&E is not alone. If you look at in New England and the Northeast, we have other utilities that are already over 20% adoption of community solar and storage and rooftop solar and storage or on-site storage. So we know that this is happening. It's evolving, and there's a need to really understand more deeply those impacts on the distribution system as we change the way that we're actually using the distribution system than its traditional role of just delivering energy from the bulk power system. And of course, as I'm talking about really planning horizons and for distribution, are the longer term horizons are 10 years. There's a lot of uncertainty beyond that, but typically 10 years has become sort of the norm for longer term distribution planning. There is short term planning that's done over maybe a 3 to 5 year period that informs near term investment planning. But the longer term horizon is also very important given the changes we're seeing.
So the overall goal is for utilities to plan to have that growth in customer-owned resources. Is that right?
That's right, both customer and community resources. So how we change the nature of the distribution system, including subtransmission, to be able to incorporate these resources. Sometimes we forget that when we connect solar and storage, community-based as well as residential, these resources are part of the overall resource mix. It's not just bulk power system anymore. We're having a significant number, as I mentioned, of resources that are coming from the edge, and essentially we're treating the distribution system as a generation tie. So, that's a completely different paradigm.
Right, exactly. That's what I was going to get to. Sorry for stepping on you there for a second. A key new approach to planning to deal with just what you were describing is something called integrated distribution system planning, or IDSP. And it's being added to the more widely used and long used integrated resource plans that have are in place. What are the objectives that policymakers and utilities expect to accomplish with IDSP, distribution system planning? And have we seen results in that yet?
Yeah, I would say there are three basic objectives that are driving IDSP, that have been driving it, I should say, because this has been an initiative across the U.S. that started approximately 10 years ago, and we're now reached, I think there's 20 states or so that Berkeley Labs has identified that have adopted formal IDSP processes and practices. I would say of the three, so there's improving the transparency of the distribution planning process and the utility investment decision-making criteria and process,
Mm,
because that's been fairly opaque for a lot of regulators and almost not visible at all to stakeholders. So
mm,
this is a big fundamental, is just getting clarity as to what the processes are. Are they integrated or are they disparate? How much integration may be needed, and then what are the decision criteria that are being used and the evaluation methodologies employed. The second is ensuring the integration of these distinct and previously disparate planning elements. So we've had in the past separate asset planning that looked at the health of the condition of particular, like a circuit breaker or transformer or field conductors, and that process in terms of replacement, looking at whether something's about to fail, that was done separately than looking at reliability and resilience, which was separate from load growth, which was separate from DER integration, which was separate from perhaps the technology around grid modernization, or what we used to call
mm,
smart grid.
mm,
The idea is that through an integrated planning, we bring all those elements together into a process to understand overall needs, so that we can also look at solutions that can solve more than one thing. So the idea is to try and optimize how we think about and synthesize into a set of solutions that can ensure, as I said, more than one objective.
mm.
And the
Well,
third is this
oh,
optimized use
sorry.
of existing distribution infrastructure through the utilization of distributed energy resource services and managing EV charging. So these projections about 40% load growth or the DER adoption could have capacity impacts. They do. We know that through a hosting capacity analysis, for example. But the idea is, can we optimize how we think about managing DER or utilizing their services and the EV charging, such that we don't have to necessarily make as many upgrades. And so that's another clear objective, obviously, to achieve affordability.
Mm. It's worth noting the obvious, perhaps, that utilities in the past, perhaps before 10 years ago, as you mentioned, um, they didn't have to worry about what was coming from the customers. They only had to worry about what was coming from the power plants that they had contracts with, or power plants that they owned. And all of this, the that you just described so well, is about understanding what's going on the other end of the system, where the homes and businesses are. That's right, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So they, in many cases, utilities don't even really have the personnel or the organizations, or I shouldn't say don't have them. They're only beginning to develop the personnel and organizational skills to understand and plan for what's coming at the customer end. Has the IDSPs, let me phrase that in English, have the IDSPs that have been used begun bringing in customer-owned distributed energy resources, at least into the planning processes? Have utilities effectively been using those resources yet to optimize the delivery of electricity and make it more affordable and reliable?
In terms of incorporating customer-owned resources and community-owned resources into the planning process, yes, that has been happening. And I would say that's the best practice and widely used practices. And the tools to do that have also been developing over the past decade, and particularly the last 6, 7 years. So that we have a good understanding, we have tools to be able to assess that in the planning process. In terms of utilizing distributed resources to provide what we call distribution grid services, or those capabilities that will help mitigate the need for capacity increases, for example, we've had for some time, again, about 8 years, 6 to 8 years, the use of non-wires alternatives or non-wire services in several states to do that. They have not been all that successful for a variety of reasons, some of which is cost, some of which is the nature of the contracting, the risks allocation between the entities, and the financial implications that has for the service provider, and just the performance may or may not have lined up very well. So there's been a number of factors why that hasn't been all that successful. But there's been an effort recently to think more broadly than just using a procurement through a bilateral contract to source distributed resource services from an aggregator or single resource. And that is to think about a portfolio approach of thinking about how we leverage retail rates, how we think about maybe reorienting energy efficiency and demand response programs to more geo-targeted use, where we start to focus on distribution needs more specifically with those, and then also think about how we might then modify or enhance or improve how we contract for services for those procurements. And there's been a lot of lessons learned, and there's a paper that we're about to release as part of the Department of Energy's distribution grid transformation program under the distributed resource utilization project that I'm part of, that actually examines some of those issues based on interviews we've had with DER aggregators and utilities. But there is an effort to start to better understand. There's a recognition that we have to be able to leverage these resources, and we have to think about it as an orchestration. There's no one solution. We're going to need a portfolio, and how do we optimize that portfolio? In a way, no different than how we think about resource planning at the bulk system, but this is at the distribution level, if you will.
And that's what I want to ask about in this last question that we have. Um, it's there's a newer approach. It's called integrated system planning, or ISP by some people, that essentially combines the IRP, the traditional IRP, and the newer IDSP into one whole system. And I'm seeing in papers that I read, and I'm sure you're seeing it too, this idea of orchestrating all the resources available to a utility, um, including bulk system resources like utility scale power, solar and wind plants, and customer and community owned resources at the distribution system level. Is this idea of an integrated system plan an important step forward, or does it make it the whole process too complicated? If it is a step forward, has it proven to be effective yet, or is it still conceptual? And as a concept, could it be the ultimate solution for energy transition planning?
So in terms of integrated system planning, yes, in my view, it is a necessary next step that we need to do in the electricity industry, not just here in the U.S., but around the world. And that's because if you're going to have upwards of 40% of the resource mix on distribution, then we need to think also about how that fits in with the overall bulk system that may be providing 60%, right? So we have to think about both parts of these simultaneously. Now, how we do that is complicated. I'm not yet seeing a simple way of doing this, because each of those elements, integrated resource planning, the transmission planning, and the distribution planning, are done typically by different organizations. And it can be as many as 3 different organizations, where you have an RTO, ISO that may do the transmission planning. You have a state that does the integrated resource planning. You may have a utility also does resource planning. And then, of course, the utility does the distribution planning. So, and then some utilities do the local transmission planning that feeds into the ISO's transmission. So there's a lot of moving parts, and each of those planning processes have their own time schedule and regulatory requirements and so on. So it's difficult and challenging to get them to line up exactly. However, that doesn't diminish the need to really understand how each interplay with the other and can impact each other. So we can't just blindly pursue one without understanding the other because they do come into play with each other. The first example that I'm aware of really doing a full, complete integrated system plan is what Hawaiian Electric
Right.
pursued over the last 5 years. And I had the opportunity to be part of the Hawaiian Electric team to help them, develop that ISP process and support the working groups and the various efforts to develop that. Obviously, they had the benefit of being an integrated utility and not, within a FERC jurisdiction. So it was a lot less complications, if you will, but it still was a very complicated and involving process. I would say that when you step back and really look at it, yeah, nothing was perfect, but I think in terms of an outcome, you had a first complete sort of holistic look at how distributed resources, which they anticipate to be 50% of their resource mix, with the bulk system side, and being able to rationalize the distribution versus transmission implications, because they were able to understand and model the impacts of one on the other and so on. So there's definitely this opportunity. Clearly, NARUC and NASIO see this opportunity as well. They've had an effort a couple of years ago to look at this, and they had several regulatory cohorts get together and look at different sort of generic approaches that might apply to vertically integrated states versus restructured states versus market states and so on. And my understanding is there's they're going to relaunch another effort to examine this. Obviously, they've been looking at elements of this, including IDSP, but my understanding is there'll be a new effort underway to look at ISP more holistically.
Interesting. So we've mentioned many times on the Power Sector podcast that we're going through an energy transition, not an energy left turn. And there are complexities in bringing all this together that you've described so well, Paul. There are also technologies in it, that are causing NARUC. You mentioned NARUC, which is the National Association of Utility Regulators, and NASIO, which is the National Association of State Energy Offices, to take a look. And individual utilities are, especially those like Pacific Gas and Electric in California, or EverSource and National Grid in New England, uh, taking a look at ways to bring all this together, and very often developing technologies, distributed energy resource management systems, and using accelerated computing. In just a few seconds, if I could get you to just say something about this, Paul, do you see the new capabilities in computer management and system management being able to meet this challenge?
Yes, I would say that we've got a pretty clear roadmap of what's going to be needed in terms of capabilities. I do think, though, that we're lagging behind that implementation
Mm,
for a variety of reasons, but both the technology commercial availability as well as then the implementation side in terms of regulatory approval and then the actual software implementation. So I think, we're maybe as many as 5 years behind, where perhaps ideally it would be good to be in those states that have really moved along in terms of adoption. And so I think there's a lot of work, and I know those utilities are actively working on these, the technology development and getting the approvals for that. But yeah, that technology is we know what it needs to be, and it's being worked on. It's just we're a few years behind.
yeah. Well, we're going through a transition, and things are changing. They're going to change faster now, but we're on our way, and that's the good news. That's all the time we have, Paul. Thank you so much. Newport Consulting Group Managing Partner Paul DeMartini has provided remarkable insights into the potential of new paradigms in utility planning to address the impacts of variable and customer-owned energy resources, rising demand, and new policies. Optimize utility delivery of affordable, reliable electricity. As always, I also want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. By the way, now available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, as well as YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.